there, this is Trisha. Welcome back to my channel for another inky project. Actually, today I have several inky projects to share. This is my level 1 challenge for the Altenew Educator Certification Program. And my challenge is to create a couple of sets of cards. I need to create a his and hers set of cards using several of the techniques and tips I've learned in my Altenew Academy courses. Since I made so many cards, I split these into 2 videos. This video has the group of masculine cards, and I have another video that will have a group of feminine cards, so be sure to check that out as well. So you can see by looking at the cards, I used various supplies and techniques, but to make them a cohesive group, I used the same color palette, I gave them the same graphic, geometric feel, and I used common accents and embellishments like craft cardstock and these gold stars throughout. So you'll see that it ends up looking like a very cohesive set. So let's get started with my first card. This is a graduation card, perfect for this time of year. I have a couple nephews graduated, so I was inspired to do this. I'm starting with an A2 card panel with Neenah Solar White cardstock, the Cube Builder stencil, some Post-it tape, my palette of inks, and ink blending tools. Rather than use this stencil to create the cool 3D cube effect, I'm just going to use it in a linear fashion and create a geometric focal point on my card. So you can see I've masked off a single row, and I am just applying some blue ink first with the ink blending tool and then adding a little shading with the finger dauber there. And once I have that first row complete, I will peel off the stencil and shift it over and nestle those diamonds right in next to the first row. And I'm continuing, keeping it masked and then switching to a new color and adding that color. And I'll just repeat that process until I get a couple of rows done and I've got the look that I'm going for. Once I have that done, I can move on to the first part of my sentiment. I am stamping Congrats with VersaFine Onyx Black ink. This is from the Label Love stamp set. Then I'm going to set that aside to dry, grab a piece of craft cardstock, and trim my inked panel down just a bit so that it leaves a little border of that craft showing all around. For the second part of my sentiment, I wanted to write out the word grad, and I do not have a stamp that says that. So I grabbed this scripty alphabet from Concord and Ninth, and I am going to just stamp it out myself. I'm going to grab the letters, and this stamps together and looks like a handwritten sentiment. I'm going to fussy cut that out with a little border all around, and now I've got my sentiment complete. I knew I wanted a little more pizzazz on this card, so I am taking a strip of white paper and I'm just going to smoosh some Versamark ink all over that strip, just leaving a little handle at the end. And then I'm going to cover the whole thing in gold embossing powder. Just kind of dip it all in there. And then once I heat set this, it's like I'm creating my own strip of metallic cardstock. So I've got this beautiful gold thick metallic cardstock, and I am going to punch a whole bunch of stars out of this strip. And I'll use a couple of these on this card, but I'll save the rest and use them throughout this entire card set, and it'll help bring the designs all together. So you can see I'm just going to pop up my sentiment with a little foam tape, and I'll use liquid glue for those stars. I'm using Tombow Mono Multi-Glue. And that will complete my design. I'm just going to use a little ATG tape runner and mount this on an A2 card base. And there you have it, my first card in the set. A clean and simple design with plenty of white space, a striking, eye-catching sentiment, and beautiful color palette. So let's move on to the second card. This is a happy birthday card. I seem to reach for these all the time. And this is going to be a whole background of stamping using a single stamp. So I'm using this triangle stamp from the trigonometry set. It's just a solid triangle. And I'm setting this up in my MISTI, stamping the triangle, and after my first stamp, I'm going to shift my cardstock up 1.5 inches right along the edge there. And that seemed to be the perfect dimension to line up the corners of those triangles perfectly. And then I will just continue that process, shifting it 1.5 inches each time so that I get a whole row of triangles making a stripe up the center of the page. Once I finish that first row, then I can nestle that triangle stamp right in between the first ones, kind of facing the other direction. And I'm going to just completely repeat the process. Keep shifting my cardstock by 1.5 inches each time and finish off the second row. So I'll continue this process using my various blues and greens and pool colored inks until I've covered the whole card, except that little strip over there on the right, and I'll come back to that later. Now I am grabbing the Mega Friend die, and I'm going to die cut this 3 times from white cardstock in my Big Shot, and I will stack those 3 die cuts to give it some dimension. And then in that trigonometry set, there is a really simple modern font. It says Happy Birthday. I am going to line that up and stamp it directly onto my background in VersaFine Onyx Black ink. I'm going to cut a small strip of craft cardstock and run that along the bottom of the card and cover up that little white void there at the bottom. And then I will adhere my friend die cut so that the happy birthday sort of sits within the confines of that die cut. And then I'll sprinkle a couple of those embellishments that I made. And then I will put the whole thing on some fun foam and mount it to an A2 card base. So that will complete my second card, the perfect happy birthday card to give to a male friend. I think it's bright and cheery, and I love how this one turned out. On to my third card. This is a Sympathy card. And for this card, I'm going to be painting on dark cardstock with oxide inks for a really cool effect. So I'm starting with this deep teal colored cardstock, and then for reference, I'm marking off a square in the center with a pencil, just sort of tracing it because I'm going to leave room for my sentiment here. And then I'm going to use the leaves from the Wispy Begonia stamp set. And the idea is I'm going to stamp them repeatedly all around that square that I marked off. You can see I've created some masks up there also. And I'm using that magic powder bag because I'm going to stamp in Versamark ink, and I'll get a couple stamped down, and then I am going to cover these in white embossing powder and heat them and set them. So I'm using both sizes of these leaves, and I'm trying to stamp them first where they're not overlapping, and then when I need to use the masks, I will. So here I've got 4 of them down. I'm going to go ahead and pour on my embossing powder, and I'm going to end up having to use a paintbrush to clean off a little bit of that embossing powder. And once I have that set, I will use my masks to cover these up, and then I can stamp in between them and create this layered cluster. So I'm going to tape my panel to my glass mat and pull out some colors of Distress Oxide inks that match my palette. And these create a really cool effect on dark cardstock because they have some pigment properties to them. So I'm just going to smoosh them onto my glass mat, spritz them a tiny bit with water, and then use a paintbrush and just sort of pounce that color into the leaves here. Now you can see it really shows up very well on the dark cardstock because this ink has sort of a combination of pigment and dye properties. Now when it dries, it will dry back a little lighter and it fades a little bit, so that's fine. You can just go back in and add another layer of color if you'd like it to be more vibrant. So you can see those leaves on the right are starting to get a little more pale. I'm going to go back in and just pounce another layer of color on there. And I'm really sort of tapping my brush in rather than making strokes. It seems to deposit a little bit more of the pigment and leave like a little thicker layer, and it gives me pretty good results. So I just thought this looked really cool. It looks like the color is almost glowing off the page on this dark cardstock. And I thought all of the colors showed up beautifully on here, and I was just happy with the results. So I just kind of switched up colors on each leaf. I didn't do any fancy shading or anything like that. I just thought it would make a pretty design here. Now I will work on my sentiment. So that square that I used in the beginning to trace that area, I'm going to go ahead and stamp on that. And in this set called Delicate Primrose, there are really nice sympathy sentiments. This one I'm going to use here says sending heartfelt condolences. And I'm going to use, the heartfelt is like a scripty font, so I'm going to use the colored green ink for that. And then sending and condolences are more of a fine font, and so I'm just using black VersaFine for those. So I'm going to mat that square with some bright green cardstock just to make it pop a little bit. And then that whole thing will land right in the middle of my cluster of painted leaves. And I'll just use some foam tape on the back of that and get that popped up in the middle. And really that's all there is to this card. I just thought that painting, in real life especially, it has such a cool, like chalky, milky looking finish to it. And like I said, it almost kind of seems like it's glowing off of that page, off the dark cardstock. So I just thought I would let that shine and keep it simple on this one. So you'll see in the still shots, I tried to get a close-up of that really cool milky finish here. So let's move on to card number 4. This is a just because card. Sometimes I like to surprise my hubby with a card for no reason, so I thought whoever receives a set like this might want to do the same. So I'm using the Gradient Stripes cover die, and I am just cutting out a piece of white cardstock, and then each one of those stripes, those panels of paper, I'm going to pull each one out individually, and I am going to use the direct to paper inking technique and cover each entire stripe with a different color from my color palette. So you can see I'm using a little temporary tape to just put them on some scratch paper that holds them in place while I apply the ink. And you can see I'm using any kind of ink. You can use the Distress Oxide inks, you can use dye inks, pigment inks, it really doesn't matter. Now I'm going to take that negative piece and a little purple tape, and I'm going to temporarily adhere that to another white panel, and that is going to serve as my guide. So I can take each one of the strips and inlay it into that panel. But to give it a little bit of a funkier feel to it, I am going to tear these, I don't know, a third of the way across, and really intentionally leave a jagged edge, and then I'm going to pop them up with foam tape. So I'm just kind of making sure that I can still get my negative dye around that, but I don't want this to be perfect. I want these to be varying lengths, and I want the edges to be real rough and jagged, because I think the idea of leaving some imperfections on there is a nice contrast to an otherwise very structured linear card, and I just think it makes it more interesting. So I've varied my lengths. You can see they're kind of like gradually getting shorter, and I've worked my way down the whole panel so that I've got all those stripes popped up, and then I can take that negative space and save that for use on another card, but I've just peeled that off. For my sentiment, I wanted to I was digging through my stash to find something, and I have this old set, and it says on the bottom there, "Hey there, handsome." And I just thought that was perfect for what I had in mind, and I'm just going to stamp that on a little strip and angle one edge of it, just again for interest, do something different. And I'm going to run that across all of my popped up stripes there. I'm using some liquid glue, like a glue pen for that, just because I've got a bumpy surface, so I want to make sure it stays really well. So I'm going to pull out a few more of those stars that I made at the beginning, and sprinkle them around my card and trim down this panel just a little bit, maybe 1/4 of an inch. And then I'll mount the entire thing onto an A2 card base, just white on white. And so that gives just one more level of interest and dimension to the card, because I'll put fun foam behind that. And it creates like a shadow and a border and just a subtle edge to that card, which I think turned out really cool. Again, clean and simple, but with some thoughtful details that make the card really interesting and striking. Okay, my 5th card is a thank you card. Again, I think this is one of my most popular, most reached for types of cards. And this is a very simple design, but very impactful and I think really pleasing to the eye. So I am using this same solid triangle from the trigonometry set, and I am setting it up so that it points downward on the left side of this card panel. And I'm shifting it up 7/8 of an inch. And I had to do a little playing around with this to come up with that dimension. But what that gave me was enough overlap on the triangles to create an interesting pattern. And it gave me 5 evenly spaced triangles running down the side of the card. So that's what I was after. And in that same trigonometry set, there is a sentiment that says sending thanks. And again, it's that sort of skinny modern font. And I'm just stamping that in some dark blue ink on a scrap piece of my white cardstock. I'm going to trim it out into a sentiment strip. And then I'm going to mount it on a little piece of craft cardstock as well. And that's just going to go right along the bottom of the card. I'm using my T-ruler to get that straight. And because we have kind of a straight line down the side and a straight line across the bottom with the sentiment, we needed to add a little more movement. Like I wanted it to have some randomness to it, not quite so structured. So I'm using these wood dots. They're like wood veneer dots, and I love the look of them. They carry that craft color throughout the design, and it really moves your eye. The fact that I put them on a diagonal there, that arrangement, it just sort of softens those hard linear shapes, and it kind of moves your eye through the card. So that is it. That is like the ultimate clean and simple card. It came together super quick, but I really love how it turned out, and again, it would be a great thank you card to grab for somebody. Card number 6 is just a have a great day card, and can you believe I'm going to go back to that same triangle, solid triangle stamp from the trigonometry set. You can get so much mileage out of some of these stamps if you just get creative with how you use them. So in this case, I'm going to use the Gina K Wreath Builder template that I have in my MISTI there, and I kind of have the triangle at like a wonky angle. It's not really straight. And I am going to stamp it down and then rotate my card. This is a 4x4 piece of cardstock, and I'm going to rotate it 1 notch and then stamp it in a new color. And then each time I pick a new color and rotate it a notch until I've done that 8 times. And look at this cool design. It reminds me of those pinwheels that we had when we were kids that would twirl around in the wind. I thought it turned out really cool. So for the center, I'm going to die cut 2 different circles, a blue and a white. And then in my stash, I had this stamp that says have a great day. And I stamped that on the blue circle in some dark blue ink and then layered it with the white circle. I'm going to put that right in the center of my pinwheel with a little foam tape. And then I'm going to mount this whole thing on a piece of that dark teal cardstock right in the center. And then above and below this square, I am putting strips of craft cardstock and then wrapping a little bit of twine along each of those craft stripes, just kind of taping it on the back. And I thought that framed out my stamped panel really nicely. And again, here I go with those gold stars. And repeating elements like that throughout a set, it really lends to the cohesive nature of something, kind of keep it all consistent throughout. So let's take a look at all of my cards in this ensemble here. I'm going to kind of zoom out so you can see them all. There are my 6 cards for the His Masculine set, and I'm just really pleased with how these turned out. I think they all have a really similar vibe to them. I like that they're graphic. I like that the colors are all consistent, and I think I would be really proud to give this set to somebody. So thank you so much for tuning in with me today. I hope that you got inspired or saw something you liked. Please hit subscribe if you'd like to see more. Be sure to check out the video with my feminine set of cards, and I hope to see you again real soon. Have a great day.